He walked into the church seeking forgiveness, but found what he feared the most: a gaze capable of redeeming and condemning all at once. The sound of rain tapping on the stained glass blended with the heavy silence, and for a brief moment, hell itself seemed to pause just to listen to his confession. From the other side of the confessional came a woman's voice, soft, calm, divine, the kind of voice that heals and destroys. He didn't know her name, but every word she spoke pulled him deeper into the abyss we call love. That night, God and sin sat side by side, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence inside the old church seemed alive. The air smelled of old wood, melted wax, and the invisible weight of forgotten sins. Marcos walked down the aisle with firm steps, though his heart faltered with every echo of his boots on the stone floor. Light streamed through the stained glass, painting colors across his face, merging the sacred and the profane into one single scene. He wasn't there because of faith, he was there because he was exhausted. The world outside had dried up inside him. The money, the guns, the cold, nameless nights, everything had turned to dust in his soul. Something about that church called to him, like an ancient whisper, as if God still insisted on someone who had long given up on himself. Marcos sat on one of the pews, elbows on his knees, breathing deeply, trying to remember the last time he'd slept without the echo of gunfire in his head. The crucifix above the altar seemed to stare back at him in silence. He turned away, unable to meet the eyes carved in wood. His hands were dirty, his wrists scarred, everything about him screamed guilt. There wasn't a confession in the world that could wash away so much blood. And yet something pushed him forward. He stood up slowly, opened the door to the confessional, and stepped inside. The creak of the wood sounded like a warning. He sat in the shadows, body heavy, heart tight. He expected a priest's voice, old, tired, used to hearing the same stories. But what came instead was different. A woman's voice, soft and steady, broke the silence. "I'm listening," that's all she said. 2 simple words, but they made his world tremble. That voice sounded like it came from a place where forgiveness still existed. For a second, Marcos thought he had walked into the wrong place, that maybe this confession was a mistake, but he stayed. There was something in that voice that held him there, as if its sound had roots somewhere deep inside him. Then he began to speak. Slowly at first, then as if opening a floodgate. He spoke of death, money, dirty deals, loneliness. He spoke of everything he had never dared to tell, even himself. On the other side, silence. Not a judging one, but the kind that listens. Her name was Helena. She let the words find their own way. Her voice was calm, firm, without the cold certainty of priests. She asked little, and when she did, her questions touched exactly where it hurt. "And what did that do to you?" she asked at one point. The question cut through Marcos like a thin blade. No one had ever cared about how he felt. Memories came back in bursts. The smell of gunpowder, faces erased by guilt, the emptiness that even power couldn't fill. He tried to laugh, but his voice broke. Helena listened, and her breathing sounded as if it came from inside his chest. It was like 2 broken hearts recognizing each other without needing names. Marcos spoke, and she listened. And in that simple act, something began to move, small, invisible, but alive. The rain beat harder against the stained glass, mixing with the rhythm of his words. Outside, the city slept. Inside the church, 2 worlds collided. Helena closed her eyes, trying not to let herself feel too much, but it was impossible. She felt his pain as if it were her own. And for the first time, Marcos wanted to be a better man, not for God, but for that voice. He confessed more than crimes. He confessed the lack of love. He said the worst punishment wasn't hell, it was the emptiness of never being loved. On the other side, Helena remained silent, knowing that any careless word could break the spell. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "A heart that still feels guilt can still be saved." Marcus lowered his head and closed his eyes. The weight began to lift. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. He didn't know what he had found there, but he knew it wasn't just forgiveness. It was something far more dangerous, the desire for redemption. And maybe for love. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the air felt still, as if the church itself were watching that moment unfold. Helena stayed even after he left. The sound of the door closing echoed like the end of a prayer. Her hands trembled. She knew she had crossed an invisible line, not of faith, but of feeling. Marcos walked away without looking back, his face still wet with tears he didn't remember allowing to fall. The sky was grey, and the wind carried the scent of rain and redemption. He didn't know who that woman was, but something in him whispered he would return. Because for the first time, hell felt colder than her gaze. That night, Helena lit a candle. The flame flickered, lighting the empty confessional. The echo of his words lingered in the old wooden walls. She knelt and prayed, not for him, but for herself. Because deep down, she knew that somewhere between forgiveness and sin, their fates had already become one. And when the church bell rang, she understood. This wasn't the end of a confession. It was the beginning of something neither of them was ready to face. As he spoke, the world inside Marcos began to crack open. The images came in flashes, like scenes from a film he never wanted to watch again. A deserted street, the sharp sound of a gunshot, a body falling too slowly, the smell of gunpowder mixed with rain and fear. He wasn't just talking about crimes. He was talking about nights when his soul felt silently sold. Each memory carried its own weight, a face he'd never forgotten, an eye that dimmed before it could ask why. Vengeances carried out with cold precision, deals sealed in blood, stories of power and betrayal that looked like glory but were only chains. The entire city seemed built upon his footsteps. And yet, Marcos had never felt more lost. Helena listened from behind the wooden divider, feeling her chest tighten. This wasn't just another confession of sin. It was the outpouring of someone swallowed by a world where love always came laced with fear. She couldn't see his face, but she could see his soul. And as he spoke of a past stained with blood, she realized there was something in his pain that echoed inside her own. He spoke about the first time he pulled the trigger on someone else's command. He didn't know the man on the other side of the sight, only that he had to prove his loyalty. His hand trembled, but he fired. After that night, it never trembled again. He learnt to switch something off inside himself. And while he told her that story, he understood that the price of loyalty was living forever distant from love and from redemption. Marcos described how respect came quickly. People lowered their heads when he walked by. No one dared hold his gaze for too long. He had money, power, a bed that was never cold. But of all the stories of redemption he had ever heard, none seemed meant for him. Deep down, he knew he had built his own prison. He said he tried to leave once. Remembered a woman who almost changed his path. It wasn't a passionate romance. It was shelter. She wanted a simple life, far from secrets and violence. He almost chose that. Almost. But the past is a patient collector. And by the time he realized it, he was already too deep to ever be just a man again. Helena swallowed hard hearing about that lost chance at peace. Something in that story touched a hidden place inside her. She too had dreams ripped away. She too knew the feeling of watching her life turn to ashes because of someone else's choices. It felt strange to hear a man like him speak about matters of the heart, as if he still had one. But maybe he did. Maybe it was just buried. He talked about the nights he came home covered in blood, but without a scratch. He'd stand under the shower, letting the water fall, hoping it could wash away what he'd done. His skin came clean, but his mind filled with faces. Some he could barely remember, others he could never forget. And he confessed in a low voice that he was afraid of the day he'd feel nothing at all. On the other side, Helena felt a shiver run through her. Part of her wanted to hate him, to reject every word, to call it all monstrous. But there was something else there. a man who hated what he had become, a man who saw his soul as a dead-end street. And she knew too well what it was like to live with the feeling that your future had been stolen in a single night. He told her about a specific hit, a badly planned ambush, a burst of gunfire, the screams that still haunted his dreams. He spoke of a shot that should never have been fired, a bullet that went astray and took the life of a man who wasn't even part of the game. That day, for the first time, power tasted too bitter to swallow. As his voice painted that scene, Helena's hands turned cold. There was something haunting in the way he spoke about that innocent man killed by mistake. The way his voice cracked right there, as if that was the wound that never closed. She shut her eyes, not knowing why, and an old, buried pain inside her began to stir. Marcus admitted that after that day nothing tasted the same. Money felt too dirty. Alcohol didn't numb like it used to. The bed no longer meant rest, and the respect of others was only fear, poorly disguised. He began to realize that the stories of power and betrayal that had made him feared also made him unable to face his own reflection. He said he wasn't looking for absolution. He didn't see himself as a victim. He knew the choices he made, but he confessed that he was tired. Tired of waking up with the same metallic taste in his mouth, even without a wound. Tired of dreaming about things he didn't remember living. Tired of pretending he wasn't afraid to die alone. Helena took a deep breath before answering. Her voice came out low but steady. She said some sins leave marks that might never fade on this earth. But she also said a life doesn't have to end where it got lost. She said sometimes God writes stories of redemption using the very souls the world has already discarded. And in that moment, her words felt like they weren't only for him. Marcos heard the word story and felt a strange ache. He had never thought of himself as someone with a story, just a list of jobs done. The idea that there could still be something left to write frightened him. Because if there was still a story, there were still choices. And choices hurt more than orders. He asked, almost in a whisper, if she truly believed someone like him could ever be forgiven. The question came heavy with fear, not sarcasm. Helena closed her eyes for a moment, feeling her own memories rise like waves. She said forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it just keeps the past from deciding the ending. And sometimes, the first step isn't feeling forgiven, it's stopping the act of hiding from yourself. Her words sank into him with strange force. Marcos thought about every face he had avoided, every mirror he had turned away from. He thought about the innocent man, the stray bullet, the life he never knew but took. Something about that felt heavier than all the rest. And yet, in her voice, there was a faint promise that the ending wasn't written yet. Outside, the rain grew louder, the sound thickening as if the sky itself wanted to join their conversation. The light through the stained glass shifted, colder, bluer. The air seemed to bend beneath the weight of what he confessed. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness a heart that had spent a lifetime commanding finally learn to surrender. Helena felt there was an invisible thread tying his story to hers, though she couldn't say how or why. Still, she kept listening. There was compassion in her silence, but also a strange caution, as if she were walking on sacred ground. She couldn't see his face, but she already knew the kind of abyss he carried. And something deep inside her whispered that this man and her past were about to collide in a painful way. When Marcos stopped speaking, the silence felt alive. He felt exposed, as if stripped bare before someone he couldn't see. Yet there was also a crooked sense of relief in finally saying out loud what had always hunted him from within. On the other side, Helena took a deep breath, trying to calm her own racing heart. They didn't know it yet, but the past that bound them would soon come to claim its due. He rose from the confessional with heavy legs. Before leaving the church, he turned once more toward the altar. It felt as though he'd left behind not just words, but a piece of the past that refused to let go. And as the door closed behind him, the question left hanging in the air wasn't about God or guilt. It was about the woman who had listened. And what would happen when he finally saw the face behind that voice? In the days that followed, something shifted in Marcos. The man who once commanded others now walked the streets in silence, carrying a secret that both consumed and comforted him. Every night he returned to that church. He couldn't explain why. Perhaps guilt, perhaps curiosity, or maybe the simple need to hear that voice again. With every confession, Helena listened with the same calm, and each word from him sounded less like sin and more like a wound. The confessional had become the only place where Marcos didn't need to pretend to be strong. There, he let the iron mask fall and allowed himself to feel. Helena could tell. Even without seeing his face, she could recognize the shift in his breathing, the tremor in his voice when he touched something that broke him inside. It was strange how that dark, narrow space had become the setting for something neither of them could name. She tried to resist, prayed more, spoke less, told herself it was just compassion. But when he didn't come, the silence in the church felt larger, as if the emptiness itself had taken the shape of his name. Sometimes she spent hours watching the confessional door, wondering if he'd return. And when he did, the sound of his boots on the stone floor made her heart race before she even realized it. One afternoon, Marcos arrived before sunset. The inside of the church glowed with a golden, melancholy light, air too calm for the chaos he carried within. Walked in slowly, removed his hat, and stood still for a moment, staring at the altar. He looked different, more tired, but more human. With every visit, he shed something invisible, leaving behind the weight the world had forced him to carry. Helena, on the other side of the lattice, felt her body react to his presence. The air itself seemed to change temperature. She knew she shouldn't care, but she couldn't help it. His voice, low and husky, sounded softer now. There was no confession that day, only silence. A silence filled with everything neither dared to say. It felt as though words had become too small for what was growing between them. Then the crackle of candle flames broke the spell. Marcos took a breath, opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. There were questions he wanted to ask. About her, about why she was there, about why her voice haunted him. But he didn't ask. He just sat there listening to her breathing, as if it were a prayer. When he left, Helena felt something different. She stayed there even after he was gone, her hands resting on the wood, her heart racing. She didn't know if it was guilt or longing, but she knew that somehow that man had crossed the line between their worlds, hers, built on faith and penance, and his, built on shadows and blood. And now there was no going back. Days later, fate decided not to wait. Marcos arrived earlier than usual, and this time found the church empty. The confessional stood open, her chair vacant. For a moment he thought she wouldn't come. He walked toward the altar, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. And there, beneath the colored light of the stained glass, he saw her for the first time. She was kneeling, gathering the extinguished candles. Her face was partially lit by the fading daylight. Her hair tied simply, her expression serene but tired. For an instant he forgot to breathe. She looked like a fragment of another time, a living portrait suspended between the sacred and the human. Helena lifted her face and saw him. Neither of them moved. The world seemed to stop. That gaze lasted longer than it should have. Marcos felt the weight of his past crash into something he couldn't name. There was no desire, only a deep spiritual recognition, as if her soul had known him long before his name was ever spoken. Helena wanted to look away, but couldn't. It was as though God and sin were staring at each other in silence. She tried to hide it, adjusted the candles, turned slightly, but his voice came low, almost a whisper. "It's you." Helena froze. The sound of those words echoed inside her chest. It wasn't a question, it was certainty. The air grew heavy, as if the temple itself held its breath. She answered only with her eyes, and in that moment, no confession could ever be truer than that encounter. Marcos took a step forward, then stopped. The floor felt too fragile to hold what was being born there. He didn't know what he wanted, only that he needed to look at her one more time. Her face was simple, unadorned, yet there was a light in it that disarmed him. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen something pure, and that made it hurt even more. Helena's heart raced, but she stood firm. She knew that moment changed everything. She tried to convince herself it was just curiosity, a simple recognition, but the truth burned inside her. There was something about him that both drew and frightened her, as if fate itself had just torn away her blindfold. The distant sound of the church bell broke the trance. Time began to move again. Helena lowered her head, crossed her arms, and walked past him without a word. Marcos didn't move. He watched her disappear into the shadows of the corridor. Everything in him screamed to follow her, but he stayed still. He knew that if he took one more step, there would be no turning back. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain. Marcos walked out slowly, never looking back. His heart felt heavy and light at once. For the first time in years, he didn't know if he was alive, or if he was only just beginning to be. In that gaze, he had found something he didn't know existed. A possibility. Helena, alone, leaned against the cold wall of the sacristy and took a deep breath. Her hands trembled. She tried to pray, but no words came. His face wouldn't leave her mind. His voice, his eyes, his silence. Everything echoed inside her like a temptation time would never erase. And deep down, she knew, her faith was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. From that day on, the confessional was never the same. Every time he entered, the air seemed to change. His words came slower, the silences stretched longer. It was as if both were waiting for something to happen. A break, a touch, a sign, but nothing happened. And precisely because of that, desire grew. Helena noticed she prayed more at night. She asked for strength, for clarity, but his face always returned. Even when she closed her eyes, she still saw him under the colored glass light, half shadow, half hope. There was no escaping what had already begun. And Marcos outside those walls changed too. He stopped going to the places he used to, distanced himself from the men who shared his secrets and his crimes. He began to work alone, as if trying to cleanse his name through silence. He didn't understand what he was feeling, only that he needed to earn the right to see her again. Sin in that moment had taken the shape of purity. Two opposite worlds had touched, and now they couldn't be separated. Helena and Marcos walked different paths, but both knew destiny had already made its choice. Love or punishment had begun. Marcos started returning every day. At first he told himself it was just to ease his conscience. Another round of sins poured out into that small wooden space. But as the days passed, he realized he went less for God and more for her. The walk to the church became a silent ritual, almost sacred. Every step was a confession he wasn't yet brave enough to make. The church became the only place where time seemed to slow. Outside, the world roared, debts, threats, faces without soul. Inside, everything was slow, damp, full of shadows and soft light. Marcos always sat on the same bench before entering the confessional, as if preparing for something greater than repentance. And without realizing it, he began to wait for the sound of her voice the way one waits for redemption. Helena, in turn, began to notice the rhythm of his visits, the hours, the way he opened the door, the way he breathed before speaking. His presence became a habit her heart learned to recognize before her mind did. She tried to keep her tone neutral, her posture firm, her words precise. But behind every counsel, there was something else, a care that drifted dangerously close to affection. During prayers, his name never left her thoughts. She tried to pray for the poor, the sick, the forgotten, as she always had. But suddenly she found herself praying for that man, the one with the tired voice and the dark past. She asked for protection over him, even knowing the world he lived in was built on choices she couldn't understand. And with every plea, she felt she was treading a thin line between interceding and longing. Marcos began speaking less about crime and more about emptiness. He talked about mornings when he didn't know why to get out of bed. He confessed not only what he did, but what he felt: fear, guilt, exhaustion. Helena listened in silence, but inside something moved. She recognized that kind of pain, because she too carried a place within her where hope had once been buried. Their closeness was born there, where one broken soul recognizes another. On certain afternoons, the light through the stained glass fell directly on the confessional. Marcos couldn't see her face, but he sensed the change in the air. It grew warmer, the silence denser. When he spoke of trying to change, of leaving behind the people from his past, his voice trembled differently. It wasn't the fear of dying, it was the fear of not being good enough for a presence that shouldn't matter as much as it did. Helena's palms would sweat when he spoke of wanting to disappear, to start over somewhere no one knew his name. She knew it was dangerous to hold on to such confessions, because without realizing, she began to picture him outside the shadows, in simple clothes, in an ordinary life, walking into the church, not as a fugitive from his past, but as a man choosing to live differently. At night, after the church emptied, Helena stayed longer than before. She knelt before the altar, trying to bring order to the chaos inside her. Her prayers began to change. They were no longer learned words or memorized verses. They were confessions. She told God she didn't want to feel what she was feeling, yet she still felt it. And deep down she feared he was hearing more than she dared to admit. The prayers that once sheltered her had become mirrors. The more she begged for strength, the more she saw her heart divided. Part of her wanted to protect him. Another wanted to push him away. One part saw a man seeking redemption. The other saw a danger to what little peace she had left. And as she pleaded for clarity, all she received was silence, the kind that seemed to whisper, "Keep going. I'm still here." Marcos, out in the city, found himself praying without realizing it. He didn't know the right words, never learned how. But sometimes, in some dark corner of the streets, he looked up and murmured, "If you're listening, take care of her." It wasn't for him anymore, it was for her. And that simple shift scared him because he realized he was beginning to love someone he didn't yet have the courage to name. Desire came first as concern. When he missed a few days, Helena felt a strange emptiness in her chest. She told herself it was pastoral concern, the care of a soul in turmoil. But at night, when she closed her eyes, she didn't see just a sinner. She saw a man kneeling in the dark, fighting against his own story. And the question that haunted her was, why him among so many? When Marcos returned after those days away, the sound of his footsteps filled the entire church. Helena knew it was him before he even opened the door. His voice came out rough, unsteady, trying to hide what was missing. He mumbled something about business, about problems he had to solve, but the truth lay elsewhere. He had missed her, not the church, her. And every word he tried to conceal made it even clearer. Prayer, from then on, began to change its shape. Inside the confessional, he still called it guilt, but what it truly was the desire to stay close. He said he didn't deserve peace, yet couldn't keep away from that place. Said he felt something new, something strange. As if part of him wanted to abandon everything just to come back every day without fear. Helena understood because inside her, something similar was growing. A quiet wish that he would stay, even knowing it could destroy them both. Helena's hands trembled when she held the rosary. Every bead seemed to carry the weight of his name, a name she didn't fully know, but already loved in silence. When she whispered, "Lord, have mercy," she no longer knew if she was praying for Marcus's soul or her own. Each Hail Mary carried a trace of longing, and that frightened her, because a prayer shouldn't taste sweet and painful like a forbidden romance. Marcus began to notice how she breathed, when her voice lowered, when her pauses grew longer, when her words came slower. Over time, he realized he wasn't the only one fighting. On the other side of the wooden wall, there was another invisible war. And that realization touched him in a different way, as if, for the first time, he wasn't alone inside his darkness. Outside, life still demanded blood. Quick choices, cold responses. But every day, that world felt farther away once he crossed the church's door. In there, everything slowed down. Guilt blended with hope, fear with a strange kind of peace. And above all, his heart beat differently whenever her voice said, "I'm listening," because in that moment he felt truly seen. Helena's prayers began to merge with unspoken confessions. Instead of speaking only to God, she poured out her heart, as if he was sitting beside her, listening to everything. She told him about the man with the broken voice who had shaken her calm life like a silent earthquake. She confessed her fear of getting attached, the danger of loving someone who lived among shadows. Yet she always ended with the same plea: "Don't let me become a stone to the one you're trying to turn back into flesh." The border between faith and desire was growing thinner by the day. When Marcos entered, the air changed. When he left behind a silence that took time to fade. Helena knew something had to be done. Either she created distance, or she admitted that this bond was no longer spiritual alone. But how do you distance yourself from someone who appeared in the only place where your heart still believed it had a purpose? And so, day after day, prayer after prayer, what began as penance turned into encounter. What began as guilt turned into connection. And what began as duty turned into love disguised as care. Desire had no name on either of their lips yet, but it burned quietly between their words. While Helena tried to speak with God, her heart, unknowingly, had already begun answering for Marcos. At the back of the church, where light barely reached, faith and desire walked side by side, not touching. Not yet. Helena and Marcos kept praying, each in their own way. Neither admitting that the truest prayer had already been made, the silent plea not to lose one another. And it was within that heavy silence that fate prepared to demand its next step, the moment when her secret would finally reveal the price of the love being born. Helena hadn't always belonged to that world of empty pews and flickering candles. There was a time when her life fit inside a small house, with a warm smile across the table and a future planned in quiet hopes. She remembered the smell of morning coffee, the comforting hug before he left for work, the soft talk of children that didn't yet exist. Everything seemed simple, ordinary, until the day fate decided to stain it with blood. Since then, she had never truly believed in happy endings again. Her husband had been a gentleman, no enemies, no power, no secrets. He worked hard, came home tired, but never without a smile. That night, he went out just for a moment, something he had forgotten, something quick, a minute too long outside. Helena still remembered the sound of the door closing behind him, never imagining it would be the last goodbye disguised as routine. Not long after, the phone rang. Her world split in two, before and after. A robbery, they said, a mistake, a mix-up. A shot that wasn't meant for him. An innocent man lying in the street, not understanding why life had been taken so soon. Helena heard the words, but her body didn't respond. It felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her, leaving only a hollow space where she used to stand. From that day on, every form of love felt too dangerous to trust. The days that followed were a blur, people coming and going, embraces that filled nothing, words of comfort that sounded empty. Everyone spoke of strength, of healing, of faith in pain. But Helena saw only the empty chair at the table, the unused cup, the cold pillow beside her. Life went on, they said. She just didn't know where hers had gone. And it was in that void that guilt laid down to rest. Guilt, because he had only stepped out for a small thing. Guilt because she hadn't insisted he stay. Guilt because she hadn't been there to hold his hand in his final moments. The whole world seemed trapped in a cruel silence. And the memories came in fragments. His smile, his hurried step, the shirt that would never be worn again. That was when Helena learned that fate and secrets walk hand in hand, and that sometimes we're not only victims of what we do, but of what the world decides to take. She tried to move on, tried to return to work, to people, to conversation. But everything had changed color. Other people's laughter hurt. Their plans sounded like something from another planet. She carried a grief that didn't fit in speeches about resilience. The nights were the worst, when the house whispered absence, and the pillow still carried a scent time refused to erase. Every tear was a wordless prayer, caught somewhere between rage and longing. It was during that time that she first walked into that church. Not looking for answers, only for a place to fall apart without being watched too closely. She sat in the back, small and hunched, as if trying to disappear. The dim light of the candles felt gentler than the brightness of the world. There, between the scent of incense and old wood, she found a strange kind of comfort. No one asked questions. No one demanded explanations. With time, she began helping with small things, straightening benches, lighting candles, cleaning corners no one noticed. It was easier to care for God's house than her own. The old priest had seen her arrive so many times in silence that one day he simply handed her a rosary, asking nothing. And holding those beads, she made a silent vow. She would never again let her heart become a field for love stories that ended in tragedy. Love, to her, had become too dangerous. She never became a nun, but she hid there as if she were one. She kept her wedding ring locked inside a small wooden box, her private altar. Every time she opened it, the world seemed to spin again, as if the past refused to let her forget the cost of loving. The passion she had once dreamed of became a distant memory. From then on, she chose to live around faith, not because she was strong, but because it was the only place where she didn't have to decide anything except to stay. Years passed and the pain changed its shape. It was no longer a scream but a quiet murmur, still hurting, just softer. Helena learnt to walk between the pews like someone floating among familiar ghosts. She knew where each candle usually burned, where people sat to cry, where secrets hung in the air. She had become a silent guardian of other people's sorrows. And in that, she found a sort of purpose. Until the day he walked in, Marcos. When she heard the echo of boots on the floor, she thought nothing of it. Just another man, another burden, another story of sin she would learn to hear without trembling. But as he spoke, something in her began to break. The way he described certain scenes, certain mistakes, certain shots fired at the wrong person, awakened memories that were never hers, yet struck the same wound. There was something familiar in that blood-stained past. She didn't have details. No names, no exact dates, no precise streets. But fragments of his confession clung to her like shards of glass. A shot fired by mistake. A man who wasn't the target, fallen in the wrong place at the wrong time. A life taken for no reason at all. And worse than that, the way Marcos still carried that moment as the heaviest of his sins. Helena listened and felt something inside her tremble with a force she didn't want to feel. As much as she tried to push the thought away, one question began circling her like a shadow. What if the man behind that wooden wall was somehow tied to the night her life had changed forever? It was a thought she hated. Her faith told her not to judge. But her pain whispered that the world was too small for such coincidences. And in the pauses between his sentences, that fear grew uninvited. Still, Helena kept listening. Tears slipped quietly, hidden by the half-light, not just for him but for herself. Because the more he spoke, the more she realized there were two victims in that story, the man who died in the street, and the man who had been dying inside ever since. None of that made what happened less cruel, but it made it impossible to see Marcos only as a monster. And that realization put her in a dangerous place. Her prayers began to change. Once, she had asked God to calm her longing. Now she asked him to show her the truth. If this man truly had something to do with her husband's death, she didn't know what she would do with that knowledge. She feared hating him. She feared forgiving him. She feared loving him even more for carrying that guilt in silence. Every possibility felt more devastating than the last. And with that, her heart divided itself into layers of light and shadow. The vow she had made, never to love again, began to feel fragile. As if written in ink, the rain of time was washing away. Marcos carried everything she feared most: the world of crime, dangerous love, tangled destinies. And yet, it was with him that she felt the deepest connection, as if their pain were fragments of the same shattered puzzle. In that context, love wasn't just forbidden, it was almost a betrayal of her own grief. Helena remembered her husband with tenderness and sorrow. She didn't want his memory to become just the starting point for another story. But she couldn't deny that when she heard Marcos speak of repentance, something in her chest stirred. A quiet voice within her asked, "If God is a God of love and redemption, how far does that love reach?" And was she willing to be the instrument of that redemption, even for the man who might have stolen her future? With each visit from Marcos, her secret grew heavier. He didn't know who she was, what she had lost, or the mark she carried. To him, she was only a calm voice, a refuge, an unseen shoulder. To her, he was a restrained earthquake, waiting to reveal whether he was punishment or miracle. The cruelest part was that, even before the truth was known, her heart had already chosen, and turning back now felt nearly impossible. She began avoiding mirrors. She didn't want to see in her own eyes what she already knew, that she was trapped in a forbidden love she had never asked for. Her prayers were no longer neutral. They carried his face between the lines. And amid all this, the past kept knocking, reminding her of her husband, the stray bullet, the silent promise never to give herself to anyone again. Two worlds were pulling her in opposite directions, and there were no clear answers left. Deep down, Helena knew the day of truth was coming. The world doesn't keep secrets for long when two stories are bound like this. Sooner or later, the name of the man she lost and the name of the man she was learning to love would meet. And when that happened, it wouldn't be only her faith that was tested, but her capacity to forgive, to love, and to survive one more ending. That was her secret. Not only a past of mourning, but a love at war with her deepest pain. Between the memory of her husband and the presence of Marcos, she lived suspended on a narrow bridge where every step could be a fall. And as she prayed in silence, she no longer knew whether she was asking for strength to walk away or courage to stay. Without realizing it, the price of her faith was drawing near, demanded in the currency that hurts most, the heart. Marcos decided to change. It wasn't a promise spoken aloud, just a weariness that slowly turned into will. The days took on a different rhythm, slower, harder, cleaner. He began turning down old jobs, walking away from faces that pulled him back toward the past. But the past is persistent, and every refusal came with suspicious looks and quiet threats. The price of faith, he soon discovered, was solitude. Helena watched from afar, though she didn't know the details. She saw him arrive with a more tired face, a rougher voice, trembling hands. She could feel, between the lines of every confession, the effort of a man trying to swim against a river too dark and too strong. She prayed for him every night, lighting a candle on the altar with her own hands. And with every flame that flickered, her fear grew, fear that his search for redemption would end in tragedy. Marcos began to work for real. He found small, honest manual jobs. Felt strange to trade a weapon for a tool, command for sweat. The days ended with aching arms, but, for the first time, without emptiness. At night, he would walk to the church, no longer as a fugitive, but as someone who needed to breathe different air. Helena was always there, and the simple sound of his footsteps was enough to calm something deep within her. But the world he had left behind doesn't forget. Isolina. One night, a black car followed him through narrow streets. The rearview mirror showed headlights that wouldn't fade, a silent warning that debts remained unpaid. Marcos didn't run. He just kept walking, feeling the weight of destiny on his back. He knew peace comes with a price, and his would likely be paid in blood. Still, he didn't turn back. The next morning, Helena noticed the cut on his face. She didn't ask. She just looked, and the silence between them said everything. Marcos smiled faintly, a tired kind of irony. "Not everyone believes I can change." Helena lowered her eyes, clutching her rosary tightly. "Change doesn't need their belief, only yours." The words left her lips softly, but with firmness. He didn't reply because he knew, for her, he would keep trying. Helena's prayers changed again. They were no longer vague requests. They became specific, urgent, intimate. She asked God to protect him, from men and from himself, to keep his faith from collapsing under the world's violence. And secretly she prayed for the strength not to lose herself with him. Every candle she lit was both a promise and a silent confession of love. Time passed and the days began to blur. Marcos would disappear for 2-3 days, then return, unshaven, dirty, exhausted. He said he was trying to clean up the remnants of a life he no longer wanted. Helena listened, but deep down, she felt danger closing in. She knew darkness doesn't surrender easily, and the more he tried to escape it, the more hell seemed to chase him. One afternoon, Helena found him kneeling before the empty altar. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting colored light over his body like an undecided blessing. She stood there, watching for a while. The scene was silent and powerful. A man who once commanded others, now kneeling before something he could never control. Helena walked closer without a word, lit a candle, and let the moment itself become prayer. Marcos lifted his gaze and saw her. Her figure against the light looked almost unreal. For a second, he forgot the world. She reached out and helped him to his feet. No words were spoken. Some things only silence can say, and in that instant, silence said everything. Outside, the wind howled, making the church doors slam shut with a loud echo. Helena flinched and Marcos instinctively reached for her arm. It was quick, light, almost nothing. But it happened, a touch small enough not to be sin, yet big enough to become memory. Their eyes met for a moment too long before they both stepped back, as if the very air pushed them apart. Helena went home with her heart in turmoil. The faith that once felt solid now trembled like a string stretched too far. She spent the night pacing, sleepless, whispering prayers that no longer brought peace. She asked forgiveness without knowing for what she felt, or for what she couldn't stop feeling. At that point, love felt just as frightening as sin. Marcos didn't sleep either. He sat in the dark, staring at his hands that had once carried violence, now trembling because of a woman. He tried to convince himself that what he felt was gratitude, but he knew it was something greater, and far more dangerous. Love seemed to be the only thing capable of saving him, and destroying him at the same time. The next morning, men started looking for him again. Familiar voices, faces sent by the past. They wanted answers. They wanted control. Marcos refused calmly, but he knew what that meant. No one leaves the underworld without leaving traces of blood. He tried not to think of Helena, but her face appeared every time fear did, and it was for that face that he decided not to run anymore. Helena felt the weight of what she didn't know pressing on her chest. Something in her body warned her that time was running out. With each candle she lit, her heart tightened a little more. She asked God to spare him, but heaven's silence felt like a veiled reply. Sometimes she thought she could hear an old echo whispering, "Faith costs too much for those who love the impossible." The following days were filled with waiting. Marcos kept coming to the church, but his eyes had changed. There was no more fear, no hesitation, only a strange calm. The kind found in those who have already made peace with their fate. Helena saw it too, and panic grew quietly inside her. She wanted to tell him not to go, not to return, not to fight. But her vow of faith held her in silence. One night, as he said goodbye, Helena couldn't hold back the tears. He looked at her without a word, and for the first time he touched her face. the briefest, most solemn touch that could ever exist. "Pray for me," he said before leaving. The door closed slowly, the sound echoing like a verdict. Helena stood still, her heart beating too fast, knowing deep down that this prayer would be answered in pain. Through the night, the wind carried rain and thunder. Helena knelt before the altar and wept in silence. She could feel the world shifting, as if something far beyond her was about to move. The candles she had lit flickered endlessly, throwing shadows across the church walls, shadows that looked almost like familiar faces. Between sobs, she whispered, "Lord, if I must choose between faith and love, teach me how not to lose either." That same night, far away, Marcos walked through the rain, determined to cut the last ties with his past. The price of faith wasn't only leaving crime behind, it was risking the loss of the one person who had shown him what it meant to be human. Still, he kept walking, because he knew redemption never comes without sacrifice. And the sound of the rain followed him like a quiet prayer whispered into the dark. As Helena prayed, something inside her broke and healed all at once. She realized that faith and love were never enemies, only different forms of hope. And in that moment, she understood that loving a wounded soul wasn't losing faith, but giving it life. Yet deep down, she knew this love would demand a price, and that price was coming. The night grew heavy, dragging with it the echo of the storm. The wind seeped through the cracks in the church, making the candles flicker as if afraid. Helena didn't sleep. Something inside told her this night would not end like the others. The sky was restless, and so was her heart. She paced back and forth, clutching the rosary in both hands. When she heard it, hurried footsteps, uneven, the echo of something alive and wounded cutting through the dark. The door burst open, and the wind came in with him. Marcos stood at the entrance, drenched from the storm, his face pale, his body streaked with blood and mud. For a second, Helena froze. Time stopped somewhere between the thunder and the silence. He stumbled forward 2 steps and fell to his knees, the sound echoing against the stone floor. "Helena," was all he managed before his strength gave out. She ran to him without thinking, as if her body already knew what to do. Kneeling, she cradled his head in her lap. Blood ran down his face, mixing with the rain. Helena's heart pounded, but her voice came steady, that same voice he had come to know as refuge. "You're going to be fine." Her hands searched for the wound, trying to hold back what time had already decided. Marcos tried to smile, but it came weak. "They found me, but I didn't let them say my name." Helena looked into his eyes and saw what she had always feared: surrender. There was no fear there, only exhaustion, and a quiet peace that only those who fought too long can understand. She brushed his face with trembling fingers, cleaning what she could, while her soul quietly shattered. She helped him lie down near the altar. The cold floor seemed to welcome him, a final resting place improvised out of faith. Helena fetched cloth, water, anything she could find. Her hands shook, but she never stopped. Every touch was a silent plea. The wind made the stained glass tremble, and the candlelight danced around them like witnesses. For the first time, the church wasn't just a temple, it was alive, watching. Marcos grasped her hand tightly. His touch was warm, urgent, human. "I need to confess. One last time," he murmured, his breath faltering between words. Helena bowed her head, eyes glistening. "Not now," she said, holding back tears. "You need to rest." He shook his head. "If I die tonight, I want to die listening to your voice." The words hung in the air, heavy and soft at once. Helena felt a chill move through her. She wanted to deny it, to promise he would live, but she knew that what he asked wasn't for his body, it was for his soul. So she took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and began to pray. Her voice came low, trembling at first, then steady, as if heaven itself was listening. As she prayed, Marcos began to calm. His shoulders eased, his breathing found rhythm. He watched her, eyes fixed on her face, as if every word washed away a little of the blood on him. There was love in that gaze, a love that asked for nothing, that simply existed, pure and still, even in the shadow of death. Helena kept praying even as tears streamed down her face. "Lord," she whispered, "if there's still mercy in this world, look upon this man. He has sinned, yes, but he has suffered too. He has killed, but with every act, he killed himself a little more. If there is forgiveness for me, then let there be forgiveness for him." The words came through sobs. And then for an instant something shifted. The wind stopped, the candles steadied, and the main flame burned bright, lighting only the two of them. Marcos squeezed her hand tighter. "Do you believe in miracles?" he asked, his voice almost gone. Helena looked at him, and answered not with words. She placed both hands on his face, leaned her forehead against his, and whispered a prayer that belonged to no book. "If it's a sin to love, then may God forgive me for learning it through you." The silence that followed felt sacred. The rain outside eased, and a faint beam of light slipped through the stained glass, falling softly over them. Marcos smiled faintly, the kind of smile born after years of storms. "Then I've been forgiven," he said, just before his body grew weaker. Helena held him close, her tears falling freely. "No," she whispered. "You've been loved. Time lost its meaning." Helena stayed there, holding him, speaking softly, as if trying to convince the universe that there was still time. Every breath he took seemed to pull a piece of the world with it. And yet, somehow, there was beauty in that moment. Pain and faith, blood and purity, sin and redemption, all of it existed together, finally at peace. She rested her head against his chest and felt his heart still beating, faint, but there. "Stay with me," she murmured. He opened his eyes with effort and said something she would carry forever. "You made me believe there's still light, even for those who've walked in darkness." Helena closed her eyes, tears falling silently. In that moment, love no longer needed a name. Time stretched endlessly as his breathing grew faint, so light it was almost part of the silence. Helena didn't move. Faith seemed to have anchored her to the ground, holding her between heaven and earth. She wasn't sure if she was still praying or simply whispering to the void, but somewhere deep inside she knew he could still hear her, not with his ears, but with his soul. The storm outside had gone quiet. The church was swallowed by a stillness that felt sacred. The candles burned steadily, and his body, now motionless, seemed finally at peace. Helena leaned down, pressed her lips to his forehead, and let a single tear fall. "Go in peace, Marcos," she murmured softly. "Heaven never turns away those who learned to love." And then, between his final breath and the first light of dawn, something unexplainable happened. The candles did not flicker with the wind. The church bell rang on its own. The air filled with a faint, sweet fragrance, something unearthly, gentle, like the scent of a passing soul. Helena looked up and saw the main flame above the altar shining brighter, as though God himself had accepted the final confession. She stayed kneeling beside him for hours, unmoving, lost between faith and love, no longer enemies, but two faces of the same truth. His soul had gone in peace, and hers remained behind, trembling between grief and gratitude. What began as sin had turned into something holy, and without realizing it, Helena too had been saved. But then his breathing caught again, shallow, broken. She still held his hand, her warmth trying to fight the cold that crept through his skin. The church was dim, and the rain outside seemed to echo the rhythm of the last heartbeats. Helena didn't know whether to pray or to scream. "Helena." His voice came like a whisper through the dark. She leaned closer, her face inches from his, her tears mixing with the drops falling from the ceiling. "I'm here. I need to tell you something." "Don't speak now," she said softly, her hand trembling on his chest. "Save your strength." But he shook his head, forcing each word out like a confession he could no longer hold. The man I killed. The one who never left my mind. His breath faltered. It was your husband. Everything stopped. Helena froze, her whole body turning to stone. The words hit her like thunder, in a place already full of ghosts. The church spun. The candles, the altar, the air, everything seemed to close in around her. She tried to breathe, but her chest felt hollow. For a moment, time broke apart inside her. Faith and love, guilt and loss, all bleeding into one. He looked at her, eyes trembling with despair. "I didn't know," he whispered. "It was a mistake. He wasn't the target. I swear it." She stepped back slightly, her breath quick and uneven. The sound of the rain seemed far away now. The man she had tried to save was the same man who had destroyed her life. The love she had found inside the confession box was the echo of her own tragedy. Yet she couldn't move. Marcus began to cry. A raw, broken sound that came from somewhere deeper than pain. "I wanted to die in his place," he said. "For years I looked for peace, but it always had his face. And now I see. Peace has always had yours too. I didn't deserve to find you." Helena looked at him, her eyes shining with something beyond tears. Anger came first, sharp and wild, tearing through everything she thought she believed. But behind it came something else, recognition. In his eyes, she saw the same despair she had once carried. 2 lives destroyed by the same moment, each carrying half of the same wound. Hate would have been easy. Love, that was the impossible choice. She reached out and touched his face. The skin was cold, the regret too human to ignore. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Because I don't want to die lying to you," he said. The honesty in his tone shattered what was left of her defenses. Helena stood slowly, unsteady. She turned toward the altar. The crucifix glowed faintly in the candlelight. Her eyes filled with tears. "Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why did you bring me here? Why make me love the man who took away the one I loved?" There was no answer, only the sacred quiet of the church, and somehow that silence was an answer too. She walked back to Marcos and knelt beside him. He turned his face away, unable to meet her eyes. "If you hate me," he murmured, "I'll understand. That's what I deserve." Helena shook her head slowly. "No, it's not hate." He looked up at her, confusion flickering in his fading gaze. "Then what is it?" She took a deep, trembling breath. "It's love and pain, both at once. I only know this. God forgave me for doubting him. And I can forgive you for loving the wrong way." The words fell between them like a fragile blessing. Marcos began to weep, silently this time. His body loosened as though the weight he carried had finally let go. Helena pulled him into her arms. For a single, endless moment, there was no sin, no guilt, no past, only 2 broken hearts finding peace in the same breath. His final exhale came slow and soft. His head fell gently against her shoulder, and the stillness settled over them both. Helena didn't cry out. She simply held him tighter, as if she could hold back fate itself. Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, the church bell rang once more, slow, deep, and solemn, like a confession offered to heaven. She stayed there, motionless, her face pressed against his. His body had grown cold, but the air around them was warm, alive. "You're forgiven," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. The words drifted through the empty nave, mingling with the steady sound of the burning candles. It didn't erase the past, but it changed it. What began as tragedy had become something greater than sin. The love that destroyed them had also redeemed them, and in that fragile peace between life and eternity, both had finally been set free. When morning came, light poured through the stained glass windows, bathing Marcus's body in soft golden hues. Helena looked at him and saw peace. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It was a cleaner kind of pain, born not from loss, but from love. She knelt before the altar and prayed in silence, not for him, but for herself. Because deep down she knew the forgiveness she had given him had set them both free. She only left the church when the bells stopped ringing. The wind outside was gentle, and one single candle beside the altar still burned, steady, defying the rain that fell beyond the walls. Helena walked aimlessly through the empty streets, her face wet, her heart heavy and alive at the same time. For the first time in years, her faith didn't feel like a chain. It felt like freedom. Love had cost her everything: the pain, the faith, the story. But in the end, the final act of mercy hadn't come from heaven. It had come from her. The morning was slow to rise, as if even time hesitated to begin again. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the scent of the storm, wet earth and morning. Inside the church, silence felt almost human. Candles burned in rows, their flames painting moving shadows on the ancient stone walls. Marcus's body was found kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped around Helena's rosary. His eyes closed, his face calm, as if he had finally made peace with the man he once was. Helena found him that way at dawn. For a moment she thought he was still breathing. She approached slowly, her heart racing, whispering his name into the still air. No answer. Only the faint flicker of a flame trembling in the breeze. She knelt beside him and touched his cold skin. That was when she realized he had died on his knees, just as he had lived in his final days, caught between guilt and redemption. The sunlight poured through the colored glass, painting his body in tones of gold and crimson. It looked as if heaven itself was burning behind the windows, reflecting across the stone floor and the tears streaming down her face. Helena didn't cry like someone who had lost. She cried like someone who understood. Death, in that sacred silence, didn't feel like an ending. It felt like fulfillment, a divine closing. Sin had found its rest. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, trembling between sobs and prayer. "You found what you were looking for," she whispered. "And I found in you what I didn't know I'd lost." Her voice faded into the echo of the bell tower, each sound vibrating like a heartbeat through the air. There was no guilt left between them, no punishment, no shame, only a love that had survived the impossible. For a long time she stayed there, watching the light move across the floor. The world outside seemed distant, as if only that sacred space existed. The candles burned brighter than before. And one, the one on the altar, refused to die out, no matter how the wind pressed through the cracks. Its flame stood still, pure and unwavering. And Helena knew, somehow, that something inside her burned the same way. Outside, the city was waking, bells, footsteps, the call of birds, but within the church, time stood still. Marcus's face looked peaceful, touched by light. Helena watched him until she could no longer tell if what she saw was the man himself or just the memory of him. Her tears dried slowly, leaving behind a quiet exhaustion. Love, she realized, had become prayer. She rose, her body weightless, her gaze lost in the light. Kneeling once more before the altar, she closed her eyes and whispered something only heaven could hear. No one would ever know if it was a prayer for forgiveness or a word of gratitude. But when she stood again, her face was no longer that of a broken woman. It was the face of someone who had finally understood what faith truly meant. When she left the church, she didn't look back. She walked slowly down the empty street, the rising sun painting the horizon in soft gold. Later, people would say they saw her crossing the square, dressed in light colors, her face calm, as if walking toward a destiny already written. No one ever saw her again. Not that day, nor the ones that followed. That night, the church bell rang by itself. The sound echoed through the streets like both a lament and a blessing. Those who passed nearby swore they saw light glowing through the stained glass, even though the doors were locked. Some said they smelled incense and roses. Others claimed to have heard a woman praying softly, and another voice, lower, gentle, answering her in whispers. Days turned into weeks, and Helena's body was never found. But the candle beside the altar, the same one that had burned next to Marcos, never went out. Rain came, storms passed, yet the flame kept burning. The parish priest tried to extinguish it once, but the wick lit itself again. After that, no one dared touch it. At night, they said, the flame shone brighter, and sometimes 2 shadows appeared on the wall behind the altar, a man and a woman, kneeling side by side. The rumor spread quietly among the faithful. Some called it a miracle, others penance. But many believed that God had allowed 2 souls to meet again beyond time, paying the price of faith with eternal love. And others simply said that when love is pure, heaven always finds a way to recognize it, even among ashes. Helena and Marcos became a story, a legend to some, a parable to others. But anyone who entered that church at dusk could feel it, a gentle peace, a beautiful sorrow, a sense of presence. The altar, marked by wax and time, still bore witness to a love that defied the impossible. And on evenings when the sky turned orange and the wind carried the light through the stained glass, people would look up and whisper, "Heaven is burning again." They believed it was a sign that Helena and Marcos were still praying together, reminding the world that even sin can kneel before love. Years passed and the story became a whisper among believers. The old stone church, with its faded windows and worn benches, seemed to keep the memory alive in every corner. The priest who had once cared for it was long gone. A new one came, young, devoted, unaware of the marks that certain walls refused to forget. In the first few weeks, the new priest heard whispers. People spoke of a candle that never went out, of a bell that rang on its own, of shadows kneeling to pray at dusk. He smiled, thinking it was just talk, old stories meant to scare the curious. Until one afternoon, while cleaning the confessional, he found a letter. It was carefully folded, tucked between the cracks of the dark wooden wall. The handwriting was elegant, delicate, a woman's hand. He hesitated before opening it. The paper was yellowed, scented with wax, thyme, and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. He unfolded it gently and began to read, the words rising softly in his mind, and with each line the air around him seemed to shift. He taught me that even sin can kneel before love, and that true love is the only kind of forgiveness heaven recognizes. The priest closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't know who he was, nor the woman who had written those words, but something about them struck him like a prayer whispered straight into his soul. He folded the paper again and slipped it back into its place, as though moving it might break some sacred pact between the earth and the divine. That night, as he locked the church doors, a soft breeze passed through the aisle. It brushed against the candles, and one of them, the one on the main altar, lit itself. The flame rose high and steady, glowing without consuming the wick. The priest froze. He didn't know whether to pray or simply watch. Then he heard it. It was faint, so faint it could have been the wind, a woman's voice. Soft and melodic, praying words he couldn't quite understand. Then came another voice, lower, warmer, answering. It wasn't an echo, it was a conversation. 2 souls in prayer. The priest stood still, his heart pounding, every hair on his body on end. When he finally found the courage to speak, his voice was a whisper. "May you both be blessed." The wind stopped. The flame kept burning. The priest knelt where he stood, feeling the chill of the stone floor beneath his knees, and prayed with them, not out of duty, but out of awe. In that moment, he understood something profound. Love doesn't die, it only changes shape. From that night on, no one touched the confessional again. The letter remained there, hidden among the old wood. Some say that anyone who enters the church at dusk can still hear the same voices, a whispered prayer, and a tender reply. Others believe the flame on the altar never dies because it carries within it the souls of Helena and Marcos, sin and miracle, bound together and turned into light. And so, the old church stood as a silent witness to a love that defied time. No plaques, no names, no records, only the sound of candles burning, and the faint murmur of a confession that never truly ended. Some call it a legend, others, faith. But those who listen closely swear that, beneath the crackle of the candles, two voices still speak, one asking for forgiveness, and the other answering with love. And you? Do you believe that love can truly redeem even the darkest sins? If this story touched you, subscribe and ring the bell. There are still many confessions waiting to be heard.